On October 25, 2015, at 9:42 in the morning, a group of 3 hikers descending a narrow section of Bull Spring Canyon in the Tonto National Forest came across a young man lying in the middle of a rocky trail. He was barefoot, dirty, and exhausted. His clothes were torn and soaked in desert dust. According to eyewitnesses, the guy did not respond to voice or touch. He just looked past people, as if he saw something deep in the canyon that others did not notice. At 9:50, one of the tourists called the rescue service. The dispatcher recorded, "The guy is in critical condition, doesn't seem to realize where he is." 33 minutes later, the rescue team's helicopter landed on the nearest leveled canyon ledge. The doctors noted in the report that the victim's body had no obvious fractures, but was severely dehydrated and covered with deep scratches and friction marks typical of prolonged confinement in a tight metal space. Only after he was transported to the Phoenix Medical Center and initially identified did it become clear that he was Donald Wright, one of the brothers who had gone missing in the same woods 4 months earlier. When the guy was being transferred to a gurney, he quietly repeated a single phrase, "There are 3 of them," and he heard a shot. However, the most disturbing moment happened in the helicopter. According to the paramedic, at an altitude of 2,000 feet, Donald suddenly opened his eyes, looked through it, and whispered, "Don't land near the quarry, they will hear." And none of the crew knew that in a few hours, this quarry would become the key word in a case that would throw off the official investigation from all previous versions. On June 21, 2015, at 6:35 in the morning, 24-year-old Donald Wright and his 16-year-old brother, Christopher, parked a dark blue Ford Escape at the official parking lot at the beginning of the Horseshoe Mountain Trail in the Tonto National Forest. A surveillance camera on a nearby pole recorded their arrival. The minute mark was 6:37. The video shows his older brother checking the route on the information board, and Christopher adjusting the shoulder straps of his backpack as if trying to hide his excitement about the long hike. At 7:03, Donald took the last photo of them together, standing at the fork in the road between the official trail and an abandoned mining road locals called the Phantom Mine Trail. He immediately sent this photo to his mother. She would later testify that there was nothing disturbing about her sons' faces, just their usual concentration before entering a more difficult section of the route. According to the Gila County Weather Service, the temperature in the canyon that day was up to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was moderate, and the sky was clear. The rescuers did not observe any factors that could have complicated the route in the early hours. The search team's protocols indicate that the trail was dry, with no fresh landslides or obstacles. After sending the photos, the brothers did not get in touch, which also did not raise suspicions. In this area, mobile communication disappears within 20 minutes of walking from the parking lot. Donald knew about this and always warned his mother in advance that there could be no connection for hours. Nevertheless, on June 22nd, at 9 in the morning, she sent a short message, "How are you?" which went unread. The brothers were supposed to return home by the following evening. When they didn't show up at 20:30 and the phone didn't ring again, the mother called her son's friends several times. No one had any information about changes in the route. At 21:42, she contacted the Gila County Sheriff's Office. The report was registered, and the officer on duty immediately entered the parking lot's coordinates into the system. On June 23, at 6:00, an official search operation was launched. 13 rescuers, 2 dog handlers, and 1 medic arrived at the scene. At 7:27, the first group came across the brothers' car. The doors were locked, and no signs of forced entry or struggle were found. Inside was Christopher's lightweight jacket, water, and charging cable, indicating that they had set out on the 2-day hike as planned and with sufficient equipment. At 9:53 minutes, experienced tracker Mark Hennessy discovered a subtle series of footprints in an area where the soil turned to soft sand. The footprints belonged to 2 people, one walking steadily, the other occasionally making short shifts to the side, as if tired or carrying an excessive weight. The direction led to an old mining trail that was not marked on tourist maps. 11:20. The dogs lost the scent as the trail widened and turned into a stone bed. The searchers split into 3 groups and began combing the slopes, descending to different levels of the canyon. The terrain was complicated by huge boulders, crevices, and dry stream beds, exactly the kind of places where newcomers usually get lost, but Donald and Christopher were not among them. The rescuers stated that both of them had sufficient training to avoid typical dangers. However, by the evening, they had not found a single item that would have belonged to the brothers. Not a scrap of cloth, not a piece of equipment, not a wrapper from food. This complete absence of traces was the first anomaly in the case. The search lasted 3 weeks. A helicopter from the sheriff's office flew every morning and evening, flying over the same area. Rescuers checked all known emergency shelters, crevices, and areas where lost hikers had been found in recent years. But the case remained without progress. On July 10, at 17:03, the active search was officially stopped. The family was informed that further combing of the area does not bring relevant results, although the case remains open. In the final report of the search team, signed on July 18 at 9:50, there was one detail that was not given importance at the time. At 19:47, on the first day of the search, the helicopter pilot reported to the dispatcher a short metallic glint on the slope near the abandoned Old Candidate quarry. The coordinates were entered into the log, but this sector was not included in the priority list. It was decided that it was old miners' equipment. 4 months later, it would become clear. It was not a piece of iron. And that glint would become the first thread to the place where no one returned that evening. On October 20th, 2015, at 9:42 in the morning, 3 experienced hikers, Lauren Sims, David McGuire, and Elliot Hale, were descending a difficult section of Bull Spring Canyon, following a route that was not on official tourist maps. They were heading to a place where, in their words, steep geology makes the view of the canyon perfect for photos. The weather was stable. The temperature was 79 degrees Fahrenheit. There was almost no wind, and visibility was good. At 9:50, 3 minutes past 9, Lauren, who was walking first, noticed a motionless body on the narrow, rocky path. From a distance, it looked like an exhausted hiker. When they got closer, it became obvious. The guy was barefoot. His face was covered with a layer of dust. His lips were chapped. His eyes were half open. But his gaze was not directed at people. Somewhere past them, deep into the canyon. According to Elliot Hale, the guy was lying as if he had been moving on his knees and had simply collapsed from exhaustion. His arms were covered with scratches, and there were dark stripes on his shoulders that looked like traces of friction against metal. On his elbows and knees were old, healed wounds that could have been caused by prolonged confinement in a cramped room. In the audio recording, which will later be added to the case file, her trembling voice is heard. "The guy's alive, but he's almost unresponsive. He has very strange marks on his hands. He is half conscious. He repeats some words. I think he's saying, 'Don't go there.'" 10:36. The helicopter of the sheriff's office rescue team landed on a natural stone ledge 30 yards from the scene. The medics worked quickly. They set up an IV, measured his pulse, temperature, and dehydration level. The initial medical report indicated that the guy had critically low electrolytes, deep dehydration, and signs of mental shock. 11:09. The victim was brought on board. One of the paramedics, Mark Davis, noted in his report, "The patient is not oriented in time and space. He repeats the phrase in English. There were 3, and he heard the shot. Reaction to voice is slow. Secondary sensory reactions are almost absent. Only at 15:22, after fingerprint identification at a Phoenix hospital, did it become clear that the boy was Donald Wright, the eldest of the brothers who disappeared in June. The doctors could not explain how he survived in the desert canyon after 4 months of absence. During the initial examination, doctors recorded numerous signs of prolonged detention. Characteristic abrasions on the wrists, marks from belts or ropes on the shoulders, scars from old cuts, significant muscle wasting. The medical report emphasized that these effects could not have arisen from a 4-day wander in the wilderness alone, and were indicative of something much more serious. By 4 in the afternoon, Detective Anna Williams, the official coordinator of the Wright brothers' disappearance, arrived at the hospital. She reviewed the first screenshots from the helicopter cameras taken during the victim's recovery. One of the images showed Donald holding his fist on his chest, clutching something small. The medics recalled that the guy refused to open his hand until he lost consciousness. 15:56. Paramedic Davis handed the detective a small object, a small piece of dark cloth with a torn edge, soaked in dirt and sweat. It looked like a piece of a shirt sleeve or work jacket. Further examination will determine that it is part of the overalls used by workers on isolated illegal plantations. Meanwhile, doctors tried to establish contact with Donald. At 17:03, the man regained consciousness for a few seconds. But instead of answering the doctor's question about where he was, he abruptly raised his head and looked out the window, as if he had heard a sound that the others had not. After a moment, he repeated, "Don't go to the quarry. Not now. He'll wake up." The words were recorded in the medical report. Detective Williams read them twice, trying to figure out if he was talking about a person, a place, or something else. At 18:42, as Donald was being moved to an isolation ward, a short, monotone warning from the dispatcher sounded in the hallway. "Sunset in 12 minutes. Teams working in the Old Contender area have requested additional lighting." The detective was alarmed by the fact that the request for lighting came from the very sector whose coordinates had been marked as short metallic glint in the summer. It was too precise and too timely. But the most unexpected thing happened at 19:01. After receiving the internal scan results, the doctors handed the detective a brief report. Microscopic particles of ore dust, which is not found on the Horseshoe Main Trail, were found in the skin structure on Donald's forearm. This type of dust is typical only of the abandoned Old Claimant Quarry area. Williams didn't know that dust wasn't the worst thing they would find, and that Donald had appeared on the trail just as someone or something in the area had begun to move in the darkness of the mine passages. In the medical report for 20 hours and 32 minutes was a sentence that brought all the county's emergency services to their feet. The patient repeated several times, "He heard I ran away, and he's going to go after him." Who he was, and who exactly the guy could not explain. But exactly 20 minutes later, a new call came through on the 911 line, and it was coming from the quarry area. On October 21st, 2015, at 11 hours 47 minutes, doctors at Banner Medical Center moved Donald Wright to an isolation room on the 3rd floor. It was a standard room for patients with mental and somatic exhaustion. Dim lights, soundproofing, and constant video monitoring. According to medical protocol, only staff and official investigators were allowed access. At 12:22, Detective Anna Williams arrived at the hospital for the second time. At this point, she already had the initial dossier, a brief report from the doctors, the results of the preliminary analysis of the samples from Donald's hands, and a recording of his words made by the paramedics in the canyon. Williams carefully reviewed the documents in the hallway, waiting for the psychiatrist's permission to make first contact. At 13:01, the psychiatrist, Dr. Grayson, reported that the patient had stabilized enough to allow a brief conversation, without pressure and without questions that might trigger a panic response. According to Grayson, Donald was not oriented in time, but responded to a calm voice and recognized the presence of people around him. His speech was intermittent, but coherent in short fragments. At 13:08 minutes, the detective entered the room. Surveillance camera number 3 captured the moment. Donald was sitting on the bed, leaning back against the wall, his legs tucked under him. His hands were shaking, but he kept them close to his chest, as if trying to protect some invisible object. His face showed an expression of alertness that bordered on animal fear. She introduced herself, gave the current date, and explained that she was only staying close to him to help him understand that he was safe. Donald listened, but his gaze remained fixed, not on her, but on the area to the right of the door, where there was nothing but a wall. At 13:23, he spoke words meaningfully for the first time. 4 months. Dr. Grayson nodded to the detective. It was the first sign that his memory was beginning to recover. Williams asked a neutral question, allowed by protocol. "Do you remember where you were?" The recorded pause lasted almost 30 seconds. After that, he whispered, "Dark, metal. It smelled like dust and water. There was a sound, dripping, always." In the medical record, this is described as a sensory fragment of the conditions of detention. Monotonous sounds, cramped metal space, lack of natural light. At 13:35, he began to speak faster, fragmented but without fear. The protocol reproduces his words. "We were walking. It was hot. Chris stopped, said he saw smoke. We thought it was tourists. Then, voices. In English, but with an accent. They were shouting, like they were arguing." According to Donald, the brothers first decided to go around the strangers, but did not have time. They came out from behind the trees, 3 of them, wearing camouflage, but not military, with black guns. I kept my hands up. At 13:44, the detective first noticed Donald tense up, grabbing the edge of the blanket as he recalled the moment of the attack. He whispered, "They separated us. Chris was screaming my name. Then there was a sound. One. One shot. Just one. Williams stopped the conversation with a gesture, not wanting to allow for any further trauma. But Donald suddenly continued on his own, quietly. I didn't see it, but I knew. Dr. Grayson noted in the report, the patient demonstrates a clear emotional connection to the moment of his brother's death, although he was not a direct eyewitness. At 14:09, he described his own restraint. A metal barrel? A container. It was narrow. I couldn't sit upright, only on the side. There was light, sometimes, when the door was opened. The detective listened intently. The key detail was what he said about the engine noise. When the door was opened, you could hear the generator, and also the smell of ammonia. This was the first technical clue. Generators and ammonia fertilizers are characteristic features of small, hidden plantations. At 14:25, he said a phrase that became a turning point. They were not alone. There was someone down there, in another room. He did not come out, but they were afraid of him. The detective clarified, without violating the protocol. Did you hear him? No, only footsteps, heavy ones, and breathing, loud, as if he was sleeping, but not completely. The recording showed that at this point the patient's skin temperature rose, a sign of stress. Grayson asked for a break, but Donald grabbed her sleeve and whispered, "He's not human. He wasn't talking." Grayson quickly intervened, explaining to the detective that it could be a confused image within a psychotraumatic reaction. But Williams recorded these words without comment. At 15:02, Donald described the escape: a downpour, thunder, a noise from above, then one of the intruders moving away from the container, and how he was able to kick out the unstable latch. He moved by feel, in the dark, going down a slope that should have been steeper, but for some reason it seemed to lead down by itself. At 15:48, he added, I heard something behind me, metallic, like a door, a big one. It closed by itself. And then, silence. Complete. Too complete. With that, the psychiatrist insisted on ending the conversation. The patient was sedated. But at 17:27, after the detective had left the hospital, the dispatcher received a short message from a technician who was checking in the area of the old applicant quarry. The entry was made in the log at 17:29. A loud metallic sound is heard underground. It sounds like something is closing. The source has not been identified. No one has been here in 2 days. This sound matched what Donald had described. On October 22, 2015, after the reappearance of the underground sound in the old Claimant Quarry area, Detective Anna Williams formally initiated an analysis of all the evidence Donald Wright had previously provided in fragmentary form. It was decided to conduct a complete reconstruction of his captivity, using medical data, psychological findings, and indirect testimony from the patient. At 9:07 in the morning, psychiatrist Grayson handed the detective a detailed report. Characteristic parallel stripes were found on Donald's skin, which could have been formed by regular contact with the walls of a narrow metal container. The marks had the same depth and direction, indicating that he had been held in a semi-sitting position for a long time. Circular abrasions, typical of restraints, were also found on the shoulders. Patient reports sleep cycle disturbance, repeats description of constant artificial noise. Source probably generator or ventilation system. The noise intervals are irregular. This detail played an important role in modeling the holding place. At 10:36, forensic expert Harper provided the results of an analysis of the dust particles left under Donald's fingernails. The composition was consistent with ore rocks typical only of the interior of an abandoned quarry that are not accessible to tourists. Harper added a note. The dust is multi-layered, introduced movement through narrow mine passages or underground workings. This was the first confirmation that Donald was not just held in a metal container, but in an underground space. 11:09. A recording from a medical camera made the previous evening, after an episode with a sudden activation of the patient, was decrypted. The recording showed that during a brief awakening, he gestured to his own feet and then made a movement as if trying to push off an invisible wall. The psychiatrist explained this as an involuntary reconstruction of the moment of escape. Based on Donald's testimony, a reconstruction of his movement underground was drawn up. It consisted of 3 blocks. 1. The moment of isolation. The protocol states, the patient reports not being able to move to full height. The container had a curved shape. The patient developed a stereotype of head tilt, which persisted after release. It was also found that there was no light at all after the container door was closed. This is confirmed by the reaction of Donald's eyes to the slightest light. The photoreceptors were reconfigured to the conditions of complete darkness. 2. Acoustic picture. During the period when Donald was conscious, he described 3 types of sounds. The dull echo of heavy footsteps, uneven breathing of an unidentified person, underground movements similar to the scrolling of metal shutters. The experts acknowledged that such sounds could have occurred in the partially collapsed quarry galleries. Particularly disturbing is the paragraph in the conclusion. The patient notes the behavior of outsiders, which indicates their fear of a third, unidentified person who was in the underground room. Escape. At 12:15, the detective received a final reconstruction of the escape episode based on motor reactions and Donald's fragmentary testimony. During the storm, water leaked through the holes underground. The guard left his post. The patient managed to move the latch, probably due to corrosion. After leaving, he moved along the tunnel wall, then slid down the slope to a lower level. The patient repeatedly points out the unusually smooth descent, which is typical of man-made tunnels, not natural formations. It was also recorded. The patient claims that after escaping, he heard the sound of a large metal door closing, possibly an automatic mechanism. This statement was consistent with the underground sound recorded by the services on October 20th and 21st. At 16:43, after re-examining the medical record, Detective Williams made a memo. Check for old mining locks in the quarry area. In response, the Geological Survey provided a brief report. There were indeed 2 underground chambers with heavy metal gates in the area, mothballed in the 90s. At 17:06, a technician working in Sector G12 sent an urgent message to the control room. We are detecting repeated ground vibration. It looks like a machine is moving under a layer of rock. The depth is approximately 20 feet. 3 minutes later, a medical alarm went off outside the hospital in Ward 3. The camera shows Donald Wright, who was under sedation, suddenly standing up, holding onto the wall, and turning his head sharply in the direction of the vibration. The psychiatrist in the report noted, the patient is demonstrating a reaction to an external stimulus that was not audible to the staff. Behavior indicates associative recognition of sound. And the last entry of the protocol of that day, made at 17:12, the patient in a state of half-sleep said the phrase, "It wasn't him who closed the door. It was something behind it." At the same moment, in the area of the old candidate quarry, the sensors recorded a short decrease in air pressure in the underground cavity, as when a large airlock is opened. On October 23, 2015, at 7:36 in the morning, the Gila County Operations Headquarters approved an order to conduct a full-scale search and assault operation in the area of the abandoned Old Contender Quarry. The order was based on three factors: Donald Wright's testimony about the underground confinement, two independent teams recording underground sounds, a geological report on the presence of mothballed metal locks under a layer of rock. At 8:09, the first units arrived at the site. 6 sheriff's office vehicles, 2 teams of technicians, a rescue helicopter crew, and a forensic field laboratory. The quarry area was closed off for a 2-mile radius. The service log states, "No unauthorized access is allowed. All civilian groups are withdrawn to the safe zone." At 9 o'clock, the 4th team began mapping the area. A quadcopter launched from the northwestern point transmitted images of old mine exits. 2 blocked, 1 partially filled in, and another with a completely flat ground surface that looked artificially compacted. It was to this one that the main group of the raid moved. At 9:43, Detective Anna Williams arrived at the scene. Her service note reads, "Detective personally coordinating Sector A. Priority is to establish an entrance to a possible underground room." She received a printout of a preliminary geological plan. The former quarry had 2 floors of workings, but the 3rd level was listed as unconfirmed, presumably closed in 1974. At 10:12, the technicians found the first evidence of trespassing: fresh shoe tread marks of sizes typical of adult men. Forensic experts noted that the soil in the area had been recently disturbed. A piece of a plastic fertilizer canister was found nearby. At 10:43, what was recorded in the report as critical confirmation of the patient's statement occurred. Technician Harper found a metal fragment on the slope, part of a heavy door latch, broken and corroded. Nearby were dots that looked like marks from blows to the metal. Anna Williams wrote down, "Probably an attempt to break in from the inside, consistent with the reconstruction of Donald's escape." At 11:03, a team of drillers drilled into the ground and reached the cavity in 50 seconds. According to the report, a 20-inch thick metal plate of iron-nickel alloy was found beneath a layer of soil. This confirmed the existence of a hidden entrance. At 11:27, it was decided to use a hydraulic lift to open the plate. The preparation took 12 minutes. All participants in the operation moved to a safe distance. 11:39. The slab shifted, and a rectangular opening opened under it, leading downward. 11:41. A camera on a cable was lowered into the underground space. The video shows a narrow corridor leading towards the southern sector of the quarry. There are traces of rust on the walls and prints on the floor that look like a body or a heavy object was dragged. At a distance of 10 feet, the camera recorded a rectangular metal container with ventilation slots. It was in this container, according to the reconstruction, that Donald was held. At 12:02, the first assault team went inside. 5 minutes after they started descending from the dungeon, they received a report. The container is empty. Inside, there are traces of habitation, scuffs on the inner walls, remnants of fabric and human hair. Everything was recorded, packed, and sent for examination. In Sector B, they found an abandoned underground room with 2 tents, an overturned table, plastic bottles, ammunition boxes, and traces of recent human presence. According to experts, the camp was abandoned no later than 2 days ago. There were 3 bunks present, confirming Donald's description of 3 intruders. At 12:30, the technicians discovered an archway of an underground branch that appeared to lead to a second cell, the one where Donald said his brother Christopher was being held. But the branch was partially blocked. After clearing it at 1309, a passage opened into a room about 8 square meters in size. On the floor was a torn hiking backpack, identified as Christopher Wright's, and the remains of synthetic fabric from his jacket. No traces of blood were found, but in the lowest corner of the room, a large dark mark was found that, according to the soil structure, could be an old organic stain. The most important evidence was found not inside, but outside. At the exit of the underground chamber, traces of rubber landing boots of the same size were found. According to the trace evidence expert, the footprints were made simultaneously, in a coordinated manner, characteristic of the evacuation of a group from an underground room. At 13:23, the operation commander reported to Detective Williams, "The facility has been completely abandoned. All life support has ceased." But that wasn't quite true. As the team climbed to the top at 13:40, Technician Harper heard a short sound, like a metal scratching. It came from the southern end of the quarry, where there were no entrances, and the geological map showed only solid rock. Harper relayed the message to headquarters. "Unidentified contact detected in a no-access area." The sound came again. This time it was clearer. The last phrase recorded at minute 13:43 was recorded in the protocol. "The rock wall is vibrating, as if someone is moving there. The source is below the surface." The search operation was not yet over, but all involved knew they had found the quarry. What remained beneath it was not. On October 24, 2015, the Gila County Sheriff's Office officially declared the underground complex in the old Claimant Quarry area shows no signs of active activity. The wording raised doubts among Detective Anna Williams. In an internal memo recorded at 9:43, she explicitly stated, "The camp was abandoned too quickly. Clear signs of evacuation. Probably the group had a warning." She then formed a parallel working group, unofficial but approved by the leadership. The main idea: to find a link between the underground activity and all similar incidents in the Arizona forests in recent years. The first step was to analyze archived criminal reports. At 11:10, Williams received a list of incidents with common features: thefts of generators within a 50-mile radius, disappearances of hiking equipment, cases of hidden plantations, periodic findings of homemade traps in remote areas. According to a summary document prepared by technician Lee Sorensen, all these cases formed a conventional triangle, with the old Claimant Quarry in the center. At 10:42, the forensic team handed over a new report on the ore dust found on Donald's hands and clothes. The analysis showed the presence of microparticles typical of deeper layers of rock that had not been subjected to natural erosion. The report states, Such particles can only be collected under conditions of forced ventilation of the underground space. That is, a blowing system could have been operating inside the complex, which even the former miners did not know about officially. 1129. The headquarters received a message from a specialist in agricultural violations. The analysis of a fragment of fabric found in Donald's fist confirmed that it was part of the sleeve of a coverall used to work on illegal plantations in desert areas. The characteristic microfibers allowed us to identify the manufacturer. Coveralls of this type were sold through only 2 stores in Arizona. One store recorded a shipment of 3 units purchased with cash 6 months ago. The buyer was not identified. At 12:38, the detective pulled up a map of the disappearances over the past 5 years. She noticed a pattern. In most cases, people disappeared in areas that had a common feature: the presence of old mining workings, unsuitable for industrial use, but convenient for hiding. They knew the terrain. They probably had access to historical maps. In the afternoon, at 14:09, a Federal Bureau agent, a specialist in illegal grow networks, joined the investigation. He handed the detective an analysis of previous cases in neighboring counties. The document states, in Pinal, Yavapai, and Coconino, groups using similar disguises and storage facilities in the form of converted containers have been dismantled in the past 3 years. The agent added that in 3 cases, the searches found mechanisms for emergency closing of heavy doors, the same as described by Donald. At 15:32, Anna Williams reviewed the materials again and created her own hypothesis, which she included in the report as an alternative model of the group's activities. The main theses were: the group had been active for at least 3 to 5 years. It had a stable source of resources, including equipment. It moved between several locations, leaving a minimum of traces. It might have had an assistant among the locals who warned about raids. By the end of the day, everything was beginning to form a clear picture. Williams had a list of places that needed to be rechecked. First on the list was the Sandstone Ridge area, the site of an abandoned plantation 3 years ago, and the traces of the same types of generators heard in the Donald's reconstruction. At 17:09, she received an internal message from the dispatcher, to whom a technician named Harper relayed the summary of the inspection of the underground complex. The airlocks on the 2nd level are locked tight. There is no data on the 3rd level. Access is impossible without special equipment. But the most important thing came at the end of the report. The air pressure at a depth below the 1st level varies unevenly. Perhaps there is another cavity there. At 17:21 in the old contender zone, the geosensors were triggered again. They recorded a short pulse movement under the ground in a sector where there were no underground passages, according to the documents. In the service log, this was the last entry of the day. The pulse has repeated. The source is moving. The direction is towards New Mexico. This meant only one thing. The group had not just escaped, it had already begun to move. At the beginning of 2018, the case of the Wright brothers' disappearance remained formally open, but in reality, it had become a cold case. Official search efforts were curtailed more than 2 years ago, and all the traces collected by the group that maintained the underground complex under the quarry did not lead to the identification of the suspects. According to internal documents from the Gila County Sheriff's Office, the attackers' activity abruptly stopped within a week of Donald's escape. Subsequently, there were no confirmed incidents related to them. Until March 19, 2018, the investigation was inconclusive. But on that very day, law enforcement officers from another state made a discovery that completely changed the situation. At 9:43 in the morning, police in San Juan County, New Mexico, conducted a sting operation against a small drug courier network. One of the detainees was Marcus Rowe, a 22-year-old man with a history of petty crime. During the inspection of his cell phone, experts found a password-protected folder called Trail. Once unlocked, it became clear that the folder contained nearly 50 photos taken in remote areas of the desert and woodlands. At 10:27, forensic scientist Alice Grant noticed one of the photos. It showed two men with guns in front of marijuana plants. The photo was taken in a forest area. In the lower right corner, there was a fragment of a third figure, a thin teenager wearing a bright orange t-shirt. Unknown, younger. Grant submitted the image to the missing persons database. 16 minutes later, the system confirmed a match. The clothing in the photo matched the description of the t-shirt Christopher Wright was last seen wearing before he disappeared. At 11:02, Detective Anna Williams received a message from New Mexico. Her memo reads, "The photo was not taken by accident. It looks like a group's work documentation. We need to establish the location." The location was determined through the file's metadata. The GPS tag pointed to a section of the Tonto National Forest, a sector located just 3 miles east of the point where the dogs lost track of Donald and Christopher in 2015. At 12:38, a formal request was made to the Federal Bureau. It didn't take long to get a response. At 13:14, FBI agent Alan Craig joined the case and confirmed. Marcus Rowe was associated with a mobile group that was moving illegal materials between Arizona and New Mexico. In the unofficial part of the note, Craig said, "These people were not working alone. There are signs of a well-organized leadership." After the first interrogation, Marcus Rowe tried to deny any involvement in the disappearances, but at 15:49, faced with the evidence, he agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. According to the interrogation report, he said, "In 2015, there were 2 boys on a plantation in Arizona who were held in different places. The older one was taken to an underground cell. The younger one did not survive the first night. After the shooting, the body was taken to the canyon." At 16:22, Rowe specified the location, a remote part of Salt River Canyon, where there are a number of narrow fissures that are inconvenient for searching. This became the basis for an immediate new search operation. At 17:00, 2 groups of rescuers, forensic scientists and geologists, left for Salt River Canyon. The air temperature was 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The area was inaccessible, and a strong wind was blowing from the canyon floor. At 18:43, one of the teams discovered a suspicious fault, marked on the map as dangerous to descend. A piece of cloth was found on a stone shelf near the entrance, which was later identified as part of Christopher's backpack. At 19:09, a camera lowered deep into the gorge captured bright orange objects. 15 minutes later, the rescuers recovered the first bone remains. The examination confirmed that these were the remains of Christopher Wright. The final report states, "Death was caused by a gunshot wound. The body was placed in a natural fault deliberately." Anna Williams made a note in her logbook. The group took their time. They knew the area. It was not an accident. It was their practice. At 22:22, Marcus Rowe's interrogation was resumed. He confirmed that after the incident in Arizona, the group ceased operations in the state and moved east to the interior of New Mexico. There they expanded their network, changing their tactics to avoid detection. However, the most important thing he said was at the very end of the interrogation, at 23:03. The man who was responsible for the boys was not with us. He did not work on the plantations. His name was different. He didn't speak, but everyone was afraid of him. The FBI agent's note added, "Rowe refuses to give a name, because in his opinion, he may still be alive." At 2042, seismologist sensors located in the old Claimant Quarry area recorded a new short pulse underground, the first in several months. The source was moving northeast. The service log described it as follows. The trajectory coincides with the route indicated by Marcus Rowe. Movement continues. This meant one thing. The group had not just changed locations, it knew it was being sought. On March 24, 2018, at 9:17 in the morning, the Gila County Sheriff's Office received official confirmation from the Forensic Analysis Lab. The remains found in a narrow rift in Salt River Canyon were those of 16-year-old Christopher Wright. He died of a single gunshot wound to the chest. The conclusion states, shot fired at close range, impact angle approximately 40 to 50 degrees. The body was placed in a natural fissure in what experts called a controlled concealment, not haphazardly, but carefully directed into the deepest part of the crevasse. This detail definitively confirmed that Christopher's death was not the result of a random scuffle or fall. At 10:30, federal agents conducted a second interview with Marcus Rowe. He provided extended testimony about the activities of the group that held the brothers, used underground rooms in old quarry workings, had equipment for ventilation and emergency locking of the sluices, did not stay in one place for long periods of time, avoided contact even with their own couriers. The interrogation report states that Marcus repeatedly emphasized the existence of an elder, an unnamed leader whom all members of the group feared. He did not work on the plantation directly, but controlled the punishment. Rowe claimed that it was this person who made the decision to eliminate Christopher without a fuss. At 12:02, an interagency group was assembled in Phoenix. Anna Williams handed over the full array of materials, including reconstructions from Donald's words. A description of the container, the ventilation, the footsteps of a heavy person, and the metal door that closed automatically. Comparisons with other cases in neighboring counties showed an almost identical MO in at least 4 incidents in recent years. At 13:27, geologists were brought in to investigate. Their conclusion was that there were illegal adits dug at an unspecified time after the 90s in the Stardy Pretenant area. Some of them had traces of technical interventions that were not on official maps. Digital measurements revealed at least 2 additional underground levels that had not been discovered during the operation in 2015. At 15:03, Federal Agent Alan Craig voiced the conclusion that formed the basis of the joint report. The group operated in several states. They did not settle in Arizona. They were on the move. This explained why, after Donald's escape, activity in the quarry area abruptly ceased. The attackers quickly moved their base. An analysis of the movements of phones seized from people associated with the network showed routes to the northeast. One of these routes crossed the New Mexico border near the Chuska Mountains. At 1725, an updated technical report was sent to the headquarters. The geosensors installed after the 2015 raid, which had not shown any activity since then, suddenly detected a short-term shift underground, the same type of shift that had been recorded several years earlier. The movement was in a direction that was consistent with Rowe's data on the group's routes. But the highlight of the day was another document, an official warning to regional offices. The Wright case has established that the group consisted of at least 3 active members and 1 unidentified individual who was in the underground and had a separate status. There are indications that this person may be alive. On March 27, 2018, the Wright family was officially informed of the results of the investigation. Donald received confirmation of what had happened to his brother. His subsequent rehabilitation lasted for months. The medical report recorded post-traumatic episodes associated with sound triggers and darkness. He returned to life slowly but reluctantly. Doctors wrote, "The patient is in stable condition, but retains behavioral reactions associated with prolonged stay in an underground, isolated environment." The last lines of the case appeared in the Federal Summary Report of April 2018. The identities of 3 members of the group have been established. They are on the federal wanted list. And one more entry, short but most revealing. The 4th person, who was responsible for the second-level premises, has not been found. Location unknown. The same report contained a field that is rarely filled out in these types of cases, a description of the risk of recurring activity. Agent Craig filled it out. Given the evidence provided and the nature of the underground cavities, the object could have moved with the group or remained in one of the undetected workings. The activity of geosensors in 2018 confirms the possibility of sustainable movement through underground channels. The federal conclusion ended with a phrase that was later quoted many times by journalists. The forest returned the body, but the shadow underground remains. And according to the Geological Survey, the last recorded pulse of underground movement originating from the old Claimant Quarry area was not eastward, but northward, in the direction of an area where there had never been any adits.